doing?
I just threw my life away, though.
I don't care. Stop! What are you doing?
This is Eric Glenn Banks Jr., and in a moment, you'll see how a police officer tried to shoot fellow officers to keep them from finding the child he hid inside a wall. By the time police arrived at the Curtis Bay house that night, something was already wrong in a way that could not be explained by confusion or delay. Officers had been called because a 15-year-old boy had failed to come out of the house when his mother arrived to take him home, and the man standing inside, a Baltimore police officer himself, insisted the boy had already left. Eric Banks Jr. told responding officers that the teenager packed his belongings, walked out earlier, and disappeared on his own. He repeated the story calmly at first, offering no urgency, no visible concern, and no request for help locating a child he claimed had run off. But as officers continued asking questions and moved deeper into the house, the calm did not hold. The house showed no sign that a teenager had packed to leave. No bag was missing. No clothing was disturbed. Nothing suggested a rushed departure or even a planned one. When officers attempted to continue their search, Banks' behavior changed rapidly, shifting from guarded cooperation to agitation, and then to outright resistance. He began interfering with the search, physically positioning himself to block access to parts of the house, and raising his voice as officers persisted. At one point, the situation escalated beyond words. Banks became combative and lunged toward an officer, reaching for the officer's gun. It was not a careless movement or a flailing gesture. It was a deliberate attempt to grab a firearm while police were present inside his home. Officers restrained him before he could succeed, but the moment changed the entire nature of the call. During the struggle, Banks made a statement that stunned those restraining him. He asked the officers to choke him, not as an insult, not as sarcasm. He asked them to cut off his air. Banks was taken into custody and removed from the house. With him gone, officers resumed the search without interference, and what they found confirmed that the boy had never left. Behind a wall, inside a concealed crawl space, police discovered the body of 15-year-old Stepson Jones. He had been hidden deliberately, placed where he would not be seen, in a space that required effort to access and conceal. The boy was dead when police found him. Later examination would determine he had been killed by asphyxiation. Only after the discovery did the full weight of who the victim was begin to settle in. Stepson Jones, known to everyone as DJ, was not a troubled runaway or a child with a history of disappearing. He was a high school student, described by teachers as focused and respectful, and by friends as quiet and kind. He played the violin, performed in school orchestra, and had no pattern of defiance that matched the story Banks had told. DJ lived in that house because Eric Banks Jr. was married to his mother. The marriage had been deteriorating for months, marked by fear, control, and repeated attempts by DJ's mother to protect her children. She had already sought legal protection against Banks, filing for protective orders and telling the court she believed he was dangerous. One of those orders had been approved, but not yet served by the time she arrived to pick up her son that day. DJ's mother did not come to the house casually. She came because she intended to remove her son from that environment permanently. She never imagined that when she knocked on that door, her child was already dead inside. By the end of the night, the house was sealed as a crime scene. The boy was gone, and the man who had been entrusted with enforcing the law was sitting in custody, no longer treated as a fellow officer, but as the central figure in a homicide investigation. Once the house was secured and the body removed, the investigation moved forward without the confusion that had surrounded the initial missing child call, because the discovery inside the wall eliminated every benign explanation Eric Banks Jr. had offered and reframed the case as a deliberate killing, followed by concealment. Investigators began with the timeline, because the story Banks told only worked if DJ had been alive and mobile at a very specific window. And that window collapsed almost immediately under scrutiny. Phone records showed no outgoing calls or messages from DJ after the time Banks claimed he left the house. Surveillance footage from nearby streets showed no teenager matching DJ's description, walking away with a bag. No neighbors recalled seeing him leave. The idea that a 15-year-old had calmly packed his belongings and disappeared without contacting anyone began to look less like a misunderstanding and more like a calculated lie. Inside the house, investigators documented the space where DJ's body had been hidden, noting that it was not an accidental location or a place a body could end up during a sudden emergency. The concealment required deliberate effort, physical control, and time, which directly contradicted any suggestion of a momentary lapse or panic followed by indecision. This was not a situation where help was sought too late. This was a situation where help was never called. The medical examiner's findings deepened that conclusion. DJ's cause of death was determined to be asphyxiation, which aligned with the absence of blunt force trauma and pointed instead to prolonged restriction of breathing. The finding gave new weight to a detail officers had already flagged during Banks' arrest, when he asked police to choke him while being restrained. Investigators did not treat that statement as coincidence. They treated it as an unguarded reflection of what had already occurred inside that house. Banks's own behavior continued to undermine him as the investigation progressed. When interviewed, he maintained his original claim that DJ left voluntarily, but his explanations shifted in subtle ways, particularly when confronted with specific questions about timing, movement, and access to different parts of the house. He could not explain why no personal items were missing. He could not explain why DJ's phone activity stopped abruptly. He could not explain how a child he claimed had left was later found hidden inside a wall.
But I was already in. I was already in the mindset of Eric's gonna die today.
Okay.
Investigators also examined the broader context of the household, and this is where the case moved beyond a single night and into a pattern that made Banks's guilt increasingly clear. Court records showed that DJ's mother had sought protective orders against Banks in the weeks leading up to the killing, describing behavior that was controlling, intimidating, and frightening enough that she believed her children were in danger. One of those orders had been granted but not yet served, meaning Banks was still living with DJ despite a legal acknowledgement that his presence posed a risk. Witness statements supported that concern. People familiar with the household described escalating tension, arguments, and an atmosphere where discipline crossed into fear. DJ was not described as defiant or aggressive. He was described as compliant, quiet, and unlikely to provoke the kind of confrontation Banks implied. That imbalance mattered because it made the notion of DJ storming out on his own even less credible. As investigators reconstructed the final day, they focused on the moment DJ's mother arrived to take him home. This was not a spontaneous visit. It was the culmination of her efforts to remove her son from Banks' control. Investigators concluded that Banks knew DJ was about to leave, and that knowledge placed him under pressure that could not be resolved through authority or delay. When DJ did not come out of the house and Banks claimed he had already left, the lie was not just about avoiding blame. It was about buying time. That attempt to control time extended to Banks's interaction with police. As a law enforcement officer, he understood procedures, limitations, and expectations. He knew how missing child cases typically unfolded. He knew initial searches were often brief. He knew that cooperation could slow suspicion, and he knew that preventing access to certain areas of the house could delay discovery long enough to change the narrative. But the plan failed the moment his behavior became physical. The attempt to grab an officer's gun was not just an act of desperation. It was the point where investigators understood that Banks was not reacting to uncertainty, but to imminent exposure. From that moment on, every prior statement he had made was reevaluated through the lens of someone trying to stop the truth from being found. By the time the investigative team completed their review, there were no alternative suspects, no competing theories, and no gaps large enough to introduce doubt. The evidence did not rely on a confession. It relied on sequence, behavior, forensic findings, and contradiction. DJ was alive in that house. DJ never left. DJ died there. And Eric Banks Jr. was the only adult present with the ability, opportunity, and motive to make that happen. With their investigation complete, the case moved forward not as a tragedy clouded by uncertainty, but as a homicide defined by deliberate actions and failed deception, setting the stage for what would unfold next inside a courtroom. By the time the investigation concluded, the facts were clear, the timeline was established, and the evidence left little room for doubt. Eric Glenn Banks Jr., once a figure of authority sworn to protect, was now the central figure in a case that would shock not only the local community, but the nation. The narrative of a missing child had been replaced by the stark reality of deliberate homicide, concealment, and betrayal. Banks was formally charged with first-degree murder, second-degree murder, and first-degree child abuse resulting in death. The charges reflected not only the act itself, but also the abuse of trust inherent in his position as both a stepfather and a police officer. Prosecutors argued that the death was preventable, that warning signs existed, and that Banks had acted with deliberate intent to control the situation, hide the evidence, and manipulate those around him. Court proceedings revealed the layers of deception and manipulation Banks had employed. When the case went before a judge, prosecutors presented phone records, surveillance footage, witness testimony, and forensic evidence detailing the concealment of DJ's body inside the wall. Each piece of evidence corroborated the timeline constructed during the investigation. Every contradiction in Banks' statements was highlighted, demonstrating not confusion but conscious attempts to mislead. The plea process was complex. Banks ultimately entered an offered plea, a legal strategy that allows a defendant to maintain innocence while acknowledging that prosecutors have sufficient evidence to secure a conviction. The plea did not diminish the severity of the case. It did not erase the betrayal, the deliberate concealment, or the life lost. It simply allowed the court to move forward without the prolonged process of a full trial, a procedural choice that ensured swift resolution for the family and the community while still holding Banks accountable. Sentencing carried the full weight of the crime. The judge emphasized the breach of trust, the abuse of power, and the deliberate steps Banks had taken to avoid detection. 42 years were handed down, a term reflecting both the gravity of taking a child's life and the systemic responsibility inherent in the abuse of authority. The sentence ensured that Banks would never again hold power over another child or position of trust. Throughout the proceedings, DJ's mother remained the quiet, painful presence in the courtroom. Her grief was undeniable, but so too was her clarity. She had warned the system, had attempted legal intervention, and had acted to protect her son, yet still the tragedy occurred. Her statements and composure became a stark reminder of the human cost behind every procedural action, every court filing, and every delayed protective measure. In the aftermath, the case left lasting questions for the community, the law enforcement system, and anyone who follows this story. How could a child's life be endangered by the very person entrusted to enforce the law? How do warning signs intersect with legal protections in ways that sometimes fail those most vulnerable? While the courtroom delivered judgment, the larger reflection remained with those left behind. The family, the investigators, and a community forced to reckon with the betrayal of trust. DJ's life, though brief, was remembered for the potential he carried, the kindness he showed, and the talent he nurtured. His death became a symbol of the consequences of authority misused and the importance of vigilance in protecting the most vulnerable. Eric Glenn Banks Jr.'s name is now inseparably tied to a story of extreme betrayal, violent concealment, and the ultimate failure to uphold a duty that once defined him.